The wind had stopped for about 3 seconds, I think that's how long it was, and it was exactly during that interval that I heard it. It wasn't the sound of cargo moving. It wasn't the metal expanding in the cold. It was something else. It came from Container 14, muffled, low, as if someone was trying not to make any sound at all but hadn't managed to control it properly. I stood there, my hand on the panel, not knowing if I had really heard it or if I had been awake for too long. But then I remembered what the man in orange had told me about 2 hours earlier, in such a low voice that I had to get closer to understand, and what he said wouldn't leave my head. I had left Baltimore about 6 hours earlier, standard cargo, nothing out of the ordinary in the documentation. I already knew the port itself. It wasn't the first time I'd made a delivery there, but normally I arrived during the day and there was activity, cranes operating, people shouting instructions from one side to the other. That night was different. It was almost 11:30 and the sector where I was directed was almost empty. The lighting was yellowish and dim, only the sound of the wind coming from the waterside. I was still maneuvering to fit into the parking space when the man appeared. Orange jacket, white helmet, but no visible badge, at least I didn't see one. He didn't come through the main entrance, he came through the side corridor between 2 blocks of containers and reached the side of my truck before I even turned off the engine. I knocked on the window, gestured that I was going to get out, but he was already pointing to the ground, telling me to lower the window right there. His voice was low, almost touching the metal of the door, and he said that I shouldn't open Container 14 under any circumstances, no matter what they asked me to. That's all. He didn't explain why, didn't give his name, didn't wait for me to answer properly. He turned and left down the same corridor before I could ask anything. I sat in the truck for about 2 minutes without getting up. I looked in the mirror and it had already disappeared. Container 14 was right in front of me, sealed, standard serial number, nothing visually different from the other 17 that were lined up there. I signed the registration with the agent who appeared later, an older man who barely looked up from his clipboard, and nobody mentioned 14. I didn't say anything either. I went to the waiting room, got some bad coffee from a machine, and tried not to look out the glass window towards the containers. I can't quite explain what made me get up and go there. It wasn't courage, certainly not that. I think it was more that feeling of not being able to stand still, knowing something was wrong and not knowing what. I left the waiting room with my coffee in hand, walked slowly down the corridor between the blocks as if I were just stretching my legs, which was the kind of thing any driver would do while waiting for clearance. Nobody paid any attention to me. Container 14 was at the end of the row, leaning against a narrower corridor where the lighting was poor. I got to within about 15 feet of it and stopped. The seal was intact, the serial number matching what was on my document. Absolutely nothing out of the ordinary visually. I stood there looking at the number, not quite knowing what I expected to see, and that's when the wind stopped. Not gradually, but all at once. And in the silence that followed, I heard it. Low, muffled, like air pressure trying to escape through a very small crack, but rhythmic, the rhythm of breathing. I took 2 steps back without realizing I'd done it. I looked at the seal again, then at the number, then to both sides of the corridor. There was no one there. I took my cell phone out of my pocket, intending to photograph the serial number. I don't know exactly why, maybe instinct, and that's when I saw there was no signal at all in that stretch, not even an emergency bar. I put my phone away, finished my coffee, which was already cold, and walked back slowly without running, because running there would attract the attention of something I couldn't yet name. I had returned to the waiting room about 20 minutes earlier when the supervisor appeared. A tall man around 50 years old wearing a port uniform but without his badge at the normal height. He was lower, turned around as if he had fallen and the supervisor hadn't noticed or didn't care. He came straight towards me with a clipboard in his hand and said there was a surprise inspection scheduled and that I needed to accompany him to the sector. He spoke too casually to be a real inspection, without the identification protocol I knew from other times, without asking me for any documents beforehand. Then I saw the second man. He was standing about 30 feet behind, leaning against the metal wall of the warehouse without a uniform, without a badge, without anything that identified his function or legitimate presence there. He didn't move at all, just stood there, staring. The supervisor didn't introduce him, didn't mention him at any point, acted as if the man simply didn't exist. I started walking alongside him because stopping there would be worse, but I paid attention to everything as I walked. That's when I noticed the cameras. 3 units covered that corridor, all with their red recording lights off. Not blinking, not in standby mode. Off. The supervisor stopped in front of container 14 and said, that was it, that I needed to activate the seal to release the inspection. The clipboard he was holding had papers on it, but I couldn't read any order numbers or authorization stamps of the type I had seen in previous inspections. The second man had moved during the journey and was now closer, about 15 feet, still saying nothing. The supervisor's radio was in its holster but with a dark screen, turned off. I stood in front of the seal with my hand in my pocket and the number 14 in front of me, and tried to calculate how many exits I had from that corridor. The supervisor repeated the order, this time without the casual tone of before, firmer, shorter, and I realized the second man had taken 2 more steps toward me without me seeing him move. I looked at the seal, then at the supervisor, then at the corridor behind me and did a quick calculation in my head. It was about 250 feet to the main exit. The second man was less than 10 feet away. The supervisor was between me and the shortest path back to the main warehouse. I put my hand in my right pocket as if to get some tool and closed my fingers on the truck key fob. I didn't look up, didn't change my expression, just pressed the alarm button and held it. The sound cut through the silence of that entire corridor at once, loud and continuous, echoing off the metal of the containers on both sides, and I was already moving before the second beep. I passed the supervisor before he could process what had happened, my shoulder almost hitting his arm. The second man tried to close the angle. I saw it out of the corner of my eye, but I didn't stop. I walked quickly, not running yet, toward the main warehouse where I had seen 2 employees in overalls earlier. The alarm was still sounding, and someone inside had already opened the side door to see what it was. That was the moment. That open door with light coming out, and a person standing in the doorway looking in my direction. When I got close enough to be seen clearly, I turned and looked back. The supervisor was standing in the middle of the corridor with his clipboard in his hand, not moving. The second man had disappeared. He hadn't gone in any visible direction. He simply wasn't there anymore, and that disturbed me more than anything that had happened earlier that night. I entered the warehouse and told the employee at the door that I had heard a strange noise coming from the container area, and that I wanted to speak to someone from security. I didn't say everything at once. I measured what I was saying. The security guard who appeared about 10 minutes later wrote down what I reported. The supervisor's name, a description of the second man, the container number, and the cameras being off. He listened to everything without interrupting and said he would check. His expression didn't change at any point, which at the time I interpreted as professionalism, but I was less certain about that later. Early in the morning, when the internal investigation really began with another team, Container 14 was no longer at the dock. There was no record of it leaving, no signed movement order, and no camera that had captured the transport because the cameras in that area had been off until almost 4 in the morning, according to the technical log. The supervisor who came to me wasn't on any shift schedule for that night. The second man was never identified. The worker in the orange jacket who warned me before check-in didn't appear in any access recordings, and no employee on the shift recognized the description I gave. I was held at the port until almost noon, answering questions from a federal investigator who arrived around 9. She was careful, methodical, making me repeat the sequence of events about 4 times in different orders, I think, to see if I would change any details. I didn't change anything because there was nothing to change. In the end, she told me I could go, that they could contact me again, and that I shouldn't discuss the incident with anyone for the time being. I left the port with the empty truck, the delivery canceled without formal explanation, and a feeling that wasn't exactly fear but was closely related to it. I no longer accept routes with containers of untraceable origin, regardless of the freight cost. I've already refused 3 shipments since that night, 2 of them with above-average payments, and I haven't regretted any of them. My freight forwarder found it strange at first, asked why. I said it was a personal preference, and she stopped questioning after the second refusal. It's become protocol. It's not paranoia, it's calculation. I know what was inside that container, and I know there was nothing I could have done differently to change those people's fate. But that conclusion, doesn't alleviate much in practice. What doesn't leave my mind is the sound. Not the truck's alarm, not the supervisor's voice, not the silence of the second man disappearing aimlessly. It's that 3-second interval when the wind stopped and the corridor became completely quiet. The muffled breathing coming from inside container 14. Rhythmic, restrained, of someone who was trying not to be heard but couldn't quite hold it in. My name is Theo Brandt. I've been driving for 11 years, and I can say with certainty that I've never forgotten a sound in my entire life the way I can't forget this one. If you're enjoying the story so far, consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a like, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. It really helps the YouTube algorithm show these stories to more people. When I pulled him off the ground and put him in the passenger seat, the first thing I thought was that I had done the right thing. It was snowing heavily, the temperature was freezing, and the man seemed unconscious on the side of the road with his jacket covered in white. But when I closed his door and returned to my seat, something didn't click. I can't say exactly what it was at that moment. It was just a vague feeling, the kind you ignore because logic prevails. About 20 minutes later, he opened his eyes, looked straight at me without the disorientation a person who had fainted would have, and put his hand on the steering wheel. It was a route I'd driven about 3 times before, a stretch of North Dakota cutting through the interior, with no gas stations and no way out for about 40 miles in each direction. That night it was worse than usual. A side blizzard reducing visibility to maybe 80 feet ahead of the truck, and a strong enough side wind for me to feel in the steering wheel. It was almost 2 in the morning and I hadn't seen another vehicle since the gas station where I'd stopped for fuel about 40 minutes earlier. Cell phone signal had disappeared well before that. When the headlights caught the silhouette, it took me a second to process what I was seeing. The man was lying exactly on the line where the asphalt met the shoulder, not completely off the road, not completely on it. An odd position for an accidental fall, but I didn't think about that at the time. I just slowed down, stopped the truck about 30 feet before and got out with the flashlight. He didn't respond when I called, didn't move when I shook his shoulder, and the snow had already covered his jacket with a thin layer, which made me think he'd been there for a while. I carried him to the cab because there was nothing else to do out there. I put him in the passenger seat, reclined, and turned the heater on full blast. I grabbed the blanket I kept behind the seat and threw it over him. I tried my cell phone again. No signal. I stared at him for a few seconds with the flashlight before turning it off. A white man, maybe 40 years old. Dark jacket soaked with melted snow. Pale face. Nothing in his outside pockets that I could see. I went back to my seat, started the truck, and kept an eye on him from the side while I drove, waiting for him to regain consciousness at any moment. I decided to keep going instead of stopping. Being stuck in that stretch of road with no signal, in the middle of the night with a snowstorm raging, wasn't going to help anyone. The next gas station I knew was about 22 miles ahead, and there I could get a signal or at least a landline to call for emergency services. I kept the heater on high and drove slowly because of the visibility, about 35 miles per hour at most, glancing at the man every 2 or 3 minutes out of the corner of my eye. It was during one of those glances that I noticed the jacket. The layer of snow that had covered it when I found it had already melted from the cabin's heat, which was normal, but the jacket was soaked in a way that wouldn't close. It wasn't just the damp outer surface from melted snow. The fabric around the armpits and in the middle of the back was dark with moisture underneath as well, the kind of stain that appears when someone has sweated a lot before putting on the clothes or has been in them for long enough. I looked again to be sure. That was it. I kept driving, but I slowed down even more without realizing I'd done so. I tried to come up with a coherent explanation in my head. Maybe he'd collapsed after too much physical exertion. Maybe he'd been running. Maybe he'd panicked before fainting. Reasonable explanations. But it was around 8 degrees Fahrenheit outside, and he'd been lying motionless in the snow long enough to accumulate a white layer on his jacket. Sweat and hypothermia under those conditions didn't add up the way I was seeing it. And the more I tried to fit one thing together, the less it made sense. We were about 11 miles from the gas station when he first stirred. It wasn't a tremor or a spasm like someone recovering from hypothermia. It was a slow, controlled adjustment of position, like someone waking from a normal sleep and checking if they're comfortable. I took my eyes off the road for a second and looked at him. The blanket had slipped a little and his right arm was exposed. Without really knowing why, I touched his forearm with 2 fingers to check his temperature. My skin was warm. Not lukewarm from the cabin heater, but warm the way it gets when your body is functioning at full capacity, at a normal temperature or even a little above. It wasn't the skin of someone who had been lying in 8 degrees Fahrenheit snow long enough to accumulate a white layer on their jacket. I slowly removed my hand and returned both hands to the steering wheel, trying not to change anything in my movement or breathing. I quickly calculated. 22 miles had turned into 11. The gas station was approaching. That's when he opened his eyes. Not with the disorientation of someone recovering from a faint, not searching for his surroundings, not blinking to adjust his vision. He opened them and looked straight ahead at the windshield, as if he already knew exactly where he was and had waited for the right moment to stop pretending. We stayed like that for about 3 seconds, him looking ahead, and me looking at the road but seeing him out of the corner of my eye, and then he slowly turned his face towards me. He said his name, Cal, as if I had asked. His voice came out firm, without hoarseness, without the effort of someone who has just regained consciousness. He didn't warn me. His expression didn't change. He didn't move in his seat beforehand. He just extended his arm and gripped the steering wheel, while I was still processing the fact that he was awake. He pulled slightly to the right, not enough to take the truck out of the lane, just enough for me to feel the resistance and understand what was happening. He gave an address. Street, number, city. Quick and clear, without hesitation, like someone who had repeated it in their head several times before. I did the math in fractions of a second. Braking abruptly on asphalt covered in compacted snow with a loaded truck would put both of us at real risk, maybe even causing a rollover, maybe losing control completely. Maintaining speed with him at the wheel meant giving up the road. I slowed down gradually, controlling myself, pretending to obey, and while doing so, I let the truck slowly drift towards the shoulder, as if it were the effect of the snow. He realized it too late. When the tires touched the frozen gravel of the shoulder, he instinctively let go of the steering wheel and I braked. The truck stopped crookedly, half on the road, half off. He lunged toward me before I came to a complete stop, trying to close the gap between the 2 seats, but I had already opened my door and gotten out. The cold hit my face all at once, 8 degrees and a crosswind, but I didn't really feel it at the time. I went to the back of the truck, placed the vehicle structure between myself and the passenger door, and waited with my cell phone in hand, still without a signal, but ready to try. He opened his door about 10 seconds later, got out slowly and stood on the side of the road looking at me over the hood, without running, without shouting, just looking. We stayed in that position for maybe 2 minutes, me behind the truck and him stopped on the other side, the wind cutting between us and the snowstorm continuing as if nothing was happening. He didn't move, didn't shout, didn't try to get around the vehicle. He just stood there looking at me with a calmness that was more disturbing than any aggression would have been. When the headlights of another truck appeared behind us on the curve, he turned and walked to the shoulder without running, without looking back, and disappeared into the darkness between the snow and the embankment as if he had entered through a door. The other truck driver stopped when he saw my vehicle tilted on the road. I got out and explained enough for him to understand that I needed help, at least to be escorted to the next gas station. He agreed without many questions, and we continued together. At the gas station, I got a signal, called the emergency number, and gave the complete description: the man, the jacket, the address he had given, the exact stretch of road. The operator wrote everything down and said a patrol car would check the area. I received no further contact after that. What the gas station attendant told me while I was having coffee is what stuck with me. He said that about 2 weeks earlier, another driver had stopped there with a similar story. Same stretch of road, man lying in the snow, same situation. This other driver had managed to get out before anything happened, but had been shaken enough to tell the story. The attendant said this in the tone of someone mentioning something they don't quite know how to classify, neither confirming nor denying, and I didn't ask anything else because I didn't want to know anything more at that moment. I finished the rest of the journey in silence, arrived at my destination almost 3 hours late, and didn't explain the reason to anyone. The jacket soaked inside stayed in my mind for days. That specific detail because it was proof that he had planned to lie there in that cold long enough to seem convincing, and that he had miscalculated only one thing: his hands. When he closed his fingers on the steering wheel, I felt the warmth before anything else, and that's what gave me the seconds I needed. I no longer stop for anyone in isolated areas without first trying to call them, no matter what I see on the side of the road. If there's a signal, I call first and wait for instructions. If there's no signal, I keep going until I get one and call from there. I've been in 2 situations since that night where I saw someone stopped on the shoulder in the early morning and didn't stop, and both times I felt the weight of perhaps ignoring someone who really needed help. I've learned to live with that weight because I already know the alternative. My name is Cal Reeves. I've been driving for 9 years, and the detail that won't leave me is simple. When he gripped the steering wheel, I felt the warmth before processing anything else, before the address, before the danger, before any decision. The warmth of normal, functional skin, of someone who had never been in any danger in that snow. He had lain in 8 degrees Fahrenheit long enough to accumulate snow on his jacket. He had planned every detail, and the only thing he didn't control was the temperature of his own hands. It was exactly 2:22 p.m. when I looked at the rearview camera monitor and saw the man appear in the image. I looked in the mirror right after, an automatic reflection, and the aisle behind the truck was empty. It took me about 2 seconds to understand what that meant, and when I did, it was too late to brake without consequence. The timestamp in the corner of the monitor said 2:22 p.m. My watch also said 2:22 p.m. But the man I had seen on the screen was no longer behind the truck when I looked in the mirror, and the impact I heard half a second later confirmed that he had never moved. The dock was located in northern Newark, a dense industrial area with concrete buildings on all sides and little room to maneuver. I had made deliveries there before. It wasn't a new route, but I knew that specific dock from 2 or 3 visits at most. I arrived around 1:40 p.m. The sun was high, with intense forklift and cargo personnel moving around the yard. The kind of environment where you're constantly on alert because people are moving in all directions, and not everyone pays attention to a large truck maneuvering in a tight space. Before starting to back up, I did my routine check on the rearview camera monitor. Standard practice, I always do this. The image was clean, without distortion, without visible lag, the timestamp in the corner showing the correct time. There were 3 dock workers in the yard at that moment, 2 with orange vests operating a forklift on the left side, and a third in dark overalls, who was near the back of my truck with no apparent function that I could identify. He stayed there for about 40 seconds, didn't touch anything I could see, then walked towards the warehouse and disappeared among other parked vehicles. I didn't think much about it at the time because there was movement everywhere, and a person standing near a truck on an active dock isn't uncommon. I started the reverse maneuver with the monitor on, the image stable, and the warehouse personnel signaling me over the radio. The maneuver was normal for about 4 minutes. Slow reverse, minor corrections, nothing out of the ordinary. The monitor showed the corridor behind me clear and unobstructed, which matched what the signalman was telling me over the radio, and I had no reason to doubt either of them. I was about 20 feet from the final stop when I paused the reverse for a second to check the monitor one last time, an old habit I always do before the final meters, because that's where most incidents happen. The image was clear. The corridor was free. No obstacles in sight. I was about to resume movement when something caught my eye in the corner of the screen. The timestamp. I grabbed my phone from the cup holder without thinking much, an automatic comparison, and looked at both at the same time. The phone showed 4:19:41. The monitor showed 14:19:38. 3 seconds difference. I stared at it for a moment, trying to come up with an explanation. Maybe the camera system's internal clock was out of date. Maybe it was a factory synchronization error, the kind of technical thing that happens and doesn't mean anything. The signalman called on the radio asking if everything was all right, and I said yes, that I would continue. I resumed reversing. But my eyes kept going back and forth between the monitor and the rearview mirror in a way I hadn't done in the previous 4 minutes, comparing the 2 images, trying to see if they matched. For about 15 seconds, they matched perfectly. An empty aisle in both. and I almost convinced myself that the difference in the timestamp was just a configuration error. Almost. There was something about that number, 3 seconds, that wouldn't leave my head, and I couldn't quite name the reason. I stopped the truck from backing up, still about 12 feet from the coupling, and got out without explaining anything over the radio. I walked quickly to the back, raised my right arm, and slowly ran my hand across the camera's field of view, a complete arc from left to right. Then I went back to the driver's side, climbed up, and looked at the monitor. I counted silently. 1, 2, 3. The image of my hand crossing the field appeared on the screen exactly at the 3rd second, clean and complete, as if it had been recorded and played back with precise delay. It wasn't a configuration error. It wasn't an outdated clock. The system was showing what had happened 3 seconds earlier, not what was happening now. And 3 seconds during a dock reversal maneuver in an urban area is enough time for an entire person to enter and exit the field of vision without appearing on the screen until it's too late. I sat there processing this, staring at the monitor that continued to show the clear, empty aisle, knowing that the image was from 3 seconds ago and that I had no way of knowing what was behind the truck at that exact moment. The signalman called on the radio, asked if there were any problems, said the lane was clear and that I could proceed. His voice sounded normal, without urgency, without pressure, the kind of tone you use when you're in a hurry but don't want to show it. I thought of the man in the dark overalls who had stood near the back of the truck before the maneuver. 40 seconds stopped without any apparent purpose, and the equation added up in a way I didn't want it to. I picked up the radio and said I was going down to check the lane personally before continuing. I received no response. The radio was silent for about 4 seconds, and then the traffic warden said it wasn't necessary, that he had a full view of the lane, and that everything was clear. His insistence is what finally convinced me. In normal procedure, no traffic warden insists you not check personally. It's standard protocol for the driver to have the right to check. I turned off the engine, put on the handbrake, and got out with my cell phone in hand, and when I went around the back of the truck, the lane wasn't empty. He was crouched on the right side of the back of the truck, right under the camera, exactly in the blind spot created by the 3-second delay. His hands were on the cargo seal. He hadn't managed to open it yet, but he was in the middle of the process, with a tool I couldn't name wedged between the seal and the latch. When I appeared, circling the bumper, he didn't hear me immediately. He remained working on the seal for about 2 seconds before raising his head and seeing me. The eye contact was brief, maybe a second and a half, but it was enough for me to read what was going through his head. It wasn't immediate panic, it was calculation. He looked at me, looked down the aisle on both sides, looked back at me, and then slowly stood up with the tool still in his hand. He didn't say anything, didn't run yet, just stood there staring at me while assessing his options. I was less than 10 feet away and there was no one else visible in that section of the yard. The signal light had disappeared. The forklifts were on the other side of the warehouse. He advanced toward me, not running, but walking quickly with his tool raised in a posture that made it clear he was going to pass me anyway. I took 2 steps back and moved aside, leaving the corridor open. An instantaneous decision. It wasn't the time to block anyone with a tool in their hand in an empty yard. He passed me without touching me, went into the side corridor, and disappeared among the vehicles parked in the same path he had disappeared before the maneuver. I stood beside the back of the truck with my cell phone in my hand, the seal scratched but intact in front of me, and only then did I realize I had been recording video since I got out of the truck. The internal report that came out 2 days after the incident placed me as responsible for the near accident. The justification was that the reversing camera system was operational according to the equipment logs, that the timestamp showed normal synchronization, and that there was no technical evidence of failure at the time of the maneuver. The dock opened an administrative process against my transport company, and my name was placed on a route suspension list while the investigation was underway. I was out of work for 10 days, waiting for something I didn't know if it would come. What changed the game was an independent technician that my lawyer hired to examine the physical camera system, not the logs, the hardware. The man in overalls had installed a small device between the camera cable and the image processor, a component that introduced a programmed 3-second delay in the signal without altering the system's internal timestamp, which continued to show the real time. That's why the logs appeared normal. The device was found still installed because he hadn't had time to remove it after I got out of the truck earlier than planned. The technical report came out in 18 days, and the administrative process was closed the following week. The legal proceedings against the man were initiated based on the video from my cell phone, the device's forensic report, and the dock access recordings that showed him entering the yard 40 minutes before my arrival. The tampered camera became the central piece of evidence, not against me, but in my favor, because it demonstrated premeditation and eliminated any argument of accident or negligence on my part. I was called to testify twice, the second time after he had already been identified and detained. The lawyer told me that the device was sophisticated enough to suggest that it wasn't the first time it had been used. I went back to work after 23 days off. A different route, a different dock. The shipping company didn't fire me, but the process cost me money and time that I won't recover, and there are at least 2 clients who asked not to assign me to that Newark sector for a while. It's not a dismissal. It's not formal guilt. It's the kind of stain that remains even after the forensic report clears your name, and everyone in the sector knows that. Before any retreat maneuver, I now do a simple test. I run my hand across the camera's field of view, count the seconds, and compare it to my cell phone. It takes about 15 seconds, and I've never found anything out of the ordinary since Newark, but I'll never stop doing it. It's become the kind of check you can't abandon after understanding what 3 seconds of difference can cost in practice. Some colleagues think it's excessive when they see me doing it, but I don't bother explaining. My name is Frank Ulrich, and what I can't get out of my head is that specific moment when I looked at the monitor and saw the hallway was clear, then looked in the rearview mirror and the hallway was clear too, and both seemed to confirm the same thing. But one of them was lying with surgical precision. 3 seconds of programmed delay, no more, no less. Enough time for a man to enter, work, and leave the field of vision without appearing on the screen until it was too late. It wasn't the near accident that stuck with me. It was the precision. Someone calculated that number carefully, and that's what I still can't let go of. Thank you for staying until the end. If you enjoy these types of human-based horror stories, make sure to subscribe to Beyond the Quiet and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your engagement, likes, subs, and comments is the only way YouTube knows this channel is worth recommending to others. Don't forget to tell me your location and the current time in the comments. Stay safe out there, and I'll see you in the next one.